How's it going, everyone? This is the history class. I'm Mr. Wannen. Today's topic is the 1930s. Let's go ahead and get started. The 1930s is a tragic time period in American history. Aside from the Civil War, this is about as bad as it gets. The suffering amongst the population was just incredible. You have about 25% of the population unemployed, who knows how many underemployed. You have mass starvation, you have people waiting in lines to get food. The real tragedy is seen everywhere. Some of the worst is just in those grim statistics. Divorce rates will skyrocket, suicide rates will skyrocket. Now, we're going to get into the causes of this tragedy, and as you can probably expect, it didn't happen overnight. It was one of those things that built up over a long period of time. So, the causes of the Great Depression. You know, the vast majority of people believe that the Great Depression was caused by the stock market crash, and it's as simple as that. This caused that. But really, you can gain a lot by understanding the true complexities that arose and caused this financial collapse. So, we're going to make it a little bit more complicated. The Great Depression was not caused by the stock market crash. It was infinitely more complicated. Now, the Great Depression wasn't helped by the stock market crash, and it certainly didn't make things better. You can definitely say that it was a contributing factor to the economic collapse, but the single factor, not at all. Now, to understand why the stock market crashed, we're going to go ahead and take a look back at the first stock market and see if we can figure out why that one crashed as well. We're going to go ahead and go back a couple hundred years to the Dutch and look at tulips. The Dutch create what we consider as the very first market in which goods and services were traded, and consequently they're going to create the very first market collapse. And this happens in a really weird, baffling way. You have in the 1600s these Dutch merchants who are growing incredibly rich in the spice trade. But what they're going to find is that although they're rich, there's just not a lot that they can spend their money on. The nobility have most of the stuff. So the only way that these Dutch merchants can actually project the fact that they are wealthy is with these immaculate houses, and especially these incredible gardens. And they're going to have kind of like an arms race with these gardens in which Dutch merchants are going to go ahead and compete with each other to see who has the nicest garden. And the thing that becomes most fashionable above all other things in these Dutch gardens was a tulip flower. And the more tulips that you had and the more rare tulips that you could afford to buy was just one of those things that demonstrated that you had more money than everybody else. And as a result, it created a market for these flowers, which themselves began to be bought and sold in this Dutch market. And as supply was fairly limited and demand was high, they drove up the price of these flowers to just breathtaking levels. At its very height, some of these flowers could catch tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. The very highest one actually sold at a price of $38,000 in today's money. So the price of these flowers skyrocketed. But what happened is that eventually somebody's going to realize, you know, it's just a flower and maybe not that valuable. And just as soon as people realize, oh my God, it is just a flower and maybe not that valuable, everybody sells. Now, so long as everybody is buying flowers, the price is going to go up and up and up. and that's called a bubble. Now, bubbles have basically all the same things in common. It's just this general belief that the price will never go down, and it's going to infinitely increase forever. But just like a bubble, they never deflate slowly. They go up and up and up and up and up, and then pop, and the price goes to nothing. The value of an object is really only dependent on what somebody is willing to give you for it. That's it. That's how you determine value. And if somebody is willing to give you $38,000 for a single tulip, well, then that tulip is worth $38,000. But if they decide that maybe the tulip is not worth $38,000 and they're not willing to give you any money for it, well, then the value is suddenly nothing. And once people begin to realize that, whoa, it's just a flower, and they all try to sell their flowers at once, they will drive down the price to zero and crash their own market. Now, the same thing happens over and over again. We have had many bubbles. For as long as we have had markets, pick a country, you can find bubbles. And we are going to have an incredibly large bubble in 1929. Now, even though it transpired several hundreds of years later, there's a lot of similarities here, all right? It's just this general belief that the prices will never go down, and they will increase and increase and increase forever, and you'll be perfectly fine. Go ahead and buy, you'll never lose your money. And that began to happen to American corporations in the 1920s. Just this general idea that if you invested money in the stock market, you were going to get your money back plus interest. You were going to make money. Just invest no matter what. These corporations never lose value. And as a result, the prices of the corporations were basically inflated for the entire decade. And as more and more people began to make a lot of money on Wall Street, it also drew in more and more people, which in a sense drove up prices. So you have all these average Americans who never invested at all in their entire lives, all of a sudden in the 1920s, drawn to the allure of just quick money. Now you have these American corporations that are selling their stocks far beyond what they're actually worth. And in 1929, people began to collectively realize, oh my God, maybe it's not that valuable. And they're all going to try to sell it once. And just like with those tulips, you can't sell it once. Once one person begins to realize, I don't think that's the right price, I don't think I'll buy it at that price, people begin to panic and sell. And if everyone sells all at the same time, then you have another market collapse. And that's what happens in the 1920s, 1929. Everybody panics, everybody sells, and they crash the stock market. It's going to lose millions of dollars in value in just a couple days. Now, does it cause the Great Depression? No. Does it contribute? Absolutely. Most people think that the stock market crash caused the Great Depression because it kind of functioned like a bucket of ice water on the country. You know, it woke people up to the fact that things were not very good at all. What they probably haven't realized, however, is that they hadn't been good for a very long time. And they're just now accustoming themselves to the things that things are not bad, things are not good, things are bad, and they're going to get a lot worse. Causes of the Great Depression stretch back years before the 1929 stock market crash. And what's really fascinating about the 1920s is that you have this facade of economic prosperity in which everyone's got a car, and you have this huge new middle class, and you've got these new roles for women and for African Americans. But if you take a really close look, that's not the case at all. Maybe some women found new roles, but not all women, and not even most. Some African Americans found a new economic middle class prosperity, but not all, not even most. A lot of people had access to the middle class and all these new amazing things that they could buy, but not all people did, not even most. And the more you look at the 1920s, the more structural flaws that you can begin to see in the economy. And it was just a matter of time before these flaws would be really just kind of ripped open and the real economic hardships laid bare for everybody. One of the interesting things about the 1930s is the fact that really there was already a large number of poor people. What happened was that you have an increased number of rich people now becoming poor people, and they suddenly realize, my God, there's a large number of poor people. Well, yeah, there already was. What you have all across the 1920s is this huge economic disparity between the rich and the poor. This is the classic, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And you have ever increasingly large numbers of people that were just locked out of that middle class economy who could not afford to participate. They couldn't buy a car, they couldn't buy those luxury items. Even with the allure of cheap credit, they were just hopelessly behind and not going to be able to catch up. So they're not going to be able to participate. The poor, there's just too many poor people in the economy in the 1930s. As many as half the population just languished in poverty. And as a result, it's going to help drag down the system. Another contributing factor to the Great Depression is what we call sick industries. Now, what I think you'll realize is how all these causes tend to be in some ways interrelated or interdependent. Sick industries are any industry in which you can work and you're going to be poor. You're just not going to be given access to the middle class. And coal mining, for example, is a sick industry. What's interesting in the 1920s and in today's economy is how many parallels we see. You know, you think about the service economy that we have in this country, that's a sick industry. You know, if you're working a service job in America, you're not going to gain access to middle class status. You're not going to be able to buy a house and buy a couple cars and send your kids to college and go on vacation. It's just not going to happen if you're working a service job. So that's a sick industry, and what we see is this rise of sick industries in which more and more Americans in the 1920s, and honestly today, is going to find themselves locked in occupations that will deny them middle class status. They're going to be poor, they're going to stay poor, and they are not going to be able to contribute. Now, farming is definitely a sick industry, but it's so terrible that it actually kind of warrants its own independent cause for the Great Depression. Farmers are going to find themselves in a huge problem in the 1920s. And it starts, actually, it dates back all the way to World War I. With war commencing in Europe in 1914, Europe is going to focus on blowing themselves up and not necessarily feeding themselves. As a result, American farmers will step up and begin to plant even more crops so that they can sell the excess to Europe, which is, at least in a short run, going to be an economic windfall for these farmers. And of course, the more they sell, the more money they make, and they begin to realize that if they can just plant even more crops, they can make even more money. And as a result, many millions of farmers are going to put even more acres of land under cultivation and try to meet not only this continent's demand, but also the European continent's demand. And really, in order to do this, these farmers, most of them anyways, are going to take huge loans and modernize their farm with brand new equipment, brand new tractors, just labor-saving devices, so that way they can increase the yields and make even more money. And this is all amazing from 1914 to 1918. But then in 1918, something terrible happens to American farmers. Europeans stop blowing themselves up and actually start farming again. And now all of a sudden, all that food that was made and sent to Europe is going to be brought back to American markets. And if you increase the supply, you're going to reduce the price and the demand. And all of a sudden, with this massive increase in food, the price of food in America just plummets. Now, that's good for a lot of people, except for the farmers. And now the farmers are going to find themselves in this incredibly vicious cycle. You know, the only way a farmer is going to make money is to grow more food. And if the price of food plummets, then their only recourse is to plant more food and try to sell that. And that's just going to exacerbate the problem, because of course, the more food they grow, the less demand and the more that price drops. So these farmers are going to find themselves on a treadmill in which the harder they work, the less value their crop actually becomes. For farmers in America, the Great Depression begins in 1918. 10 years before everybody else, farmers in this country are just going to be suffering. So by the time the 1930s rolls around, this industry is already decimated. About 30% of Americans were farmers. So this is a huge number of people that's going to be locked out of the economy. Farming is definitely a sick industry. And it's going to drag down the economy. These are people that are not going to be able to contribute. Decline in production is definitely a cause of the Great Depression. And this happens when an industry saturates their market. So in order to understand what market saturation means, let's go ahead and take a real life example. Now, I don't want to get sued, so I'm going to change the name here. I'm not quite sure on YouTube legalities, and I really don't have enough time to figure it out. So we're going to go ahead and change the name, but you can probably figure out who we're talking about. So we're going to go ahead and call this company Pear. Now, in the early 2000s, Pear came up with this amazing idea. They basically created a phone in which you can do all these really amazing things with. And it was such a great idea that everybody in the world had to have one of these phones. And Pear got rich. They became the largest company in the world because everybody had to have their product. But it gets to the point where Pear had sold a phone to everybody in the world. And how many phones do you need? 2, 3, 5? It gets to the point where you don't need a phone from Pear. As a result, their profits began to decline because they became the richest company in the world because they were selling phones. So you can almost see the situation play out in the boardroom in which Pear executives are sitting around the table and they're thinking to themselves, we have got to come up with the next big idea. Otherwise, we are not going to be the world's most profitable corporation anymore. And you can see a bunch of people sitting around the table trying to figure it out. Just don't know. I don't know how we're going to do it. And then somebody has this great idea. They're like, I got it. Hear me out. Okay, so we got this product here. What if we do this? Voila, bam, that's it right there. Pear went and took this phone and made it a little bit bigger and called it a tablet. And it was like a bolt of lightning. Now, all of a sudden, everybody in the world had to have a bigger version of the phone that they already had. And Pear got rich and was able to hold on to that title of the world's most profitable corporation. But after a couple years, it gets to the point where they sold a phone and now a tablet to everybody in the world. And how many phones and tablets do you need? And it gets to the point where they don't need to buy these things anymore and their productivity begins to fall. And Pear now finds themselves in the exact same problem. In order to remain on top, they need to find the next big thing. They need to come up with another idea. So again, pair board members sitting around the room trying to think to themselves, what are we going to do? How are we going to stay on top? And then somebody finally got it. Like, got it. All right, I got it. We had this, and then we had this. What if we do that? Bam. We'll just make it small. We'll call it a watch. People will wear it on their wrists. Unfortunately, this idea, not necessarily like the same bolt of lightning as this idea and this idea. I don't really know who these watches appeal to. It's almost as if it appeals to a group of people who can't be bothered holding on to a tablet and who don't have pockets to reach into to grab their phone. So I guess that's it right there. The market appeals to people with no pockets. And as a result, Pair wasn't able to sell a watch to everybody in the world, and their productivity has since declined. And although they're still quite a profitable corporation, they're not the world's most profitable corporation. Their sales have dropped. They have saturated the market. This happened to corporations all across the economic landscape in the 1920s. Henry Ford, for example, how many cars do you need? It gets to the point where you sell a car to everybody in America who can afford a car. And upon closer examination, it's about half the people, not all the people, half the people. So you kind of see where the problems of those sick industries come in. And Ford is not able to sell these cars anymore. And he has to slow down production, which means he has to reduce hours, lay off workers. This is going to have a ripple effect in the economy, in which so much of that 1920s economy was based on Henry Ford selling cars. And if Henry Ford is selling less cars, then he's buying less black paint. He's buying less glass. He's buying less rubber. And all these other subsequent industries are now consequently going to be making less. And here's where you have the beginnings of a bust pattern, in which corporations are going to be producing less products, so they need to have fewer workers, so they lay off workers, and of course these workers now have less money, and consequently they buy fewer products. And if they're buying fewer products, then corporations are going to be selling less, and they're going to lay off workers, and it just spirals downward. So as quick as it can spiral up, it can spiral downwards just as fast. These causes of the Great Depression are all interlinked, in which these sick industries are going to prevent people from accessing middle-class status, and as a result, they're not going to be able to contribute in the economy. They're not going to be able to buy a vacuum, a washing machine, a Henry Ford automobile. And it's going to contribute to an economic slowdown eventually. Another cause of the Great Depression is international markets. Now, this one is just baffling and crazy. And again, it relates to World War I. And what we're going to find increasingly is that a lot of these problems with the Great Depression relate to World War I. And when we get to World War II, the problems basically relate to World War I. Now, during World War I, and very quickly in the first year, the Allied powers are going to spend all the money they have buying weapons to fight the war. And then they don't have any more money. As a result, they need to borrow money. And the richest country in the world in 1914 is the United States. They're the ones that have money. So these Allied powers are going to begin to borrow money from the United States to fight World War II. And American banks are only too happy to loan money to England and France and, make the interest rates and the profits. And this is perfectly fine. The war is fought and ended for American corporations. They're getting rich. Now, at the end of World War I, England and France are indebted to the United States by billions of dollars. And England and France is going to ask the United States to forgive these loans. And the United States is just not going to have it. You borrowed that money, you have to pay that money back. This is a catastrophically stupid idea on our part. and it's going to contribute to World War II. So England and France had just fought this war. They had spent all the money they had and had to borrow money in order to continue fighting. They don't have any money, but they did win the war. What they're going to do is, in the Treaty of Versailles, they're going to force Germany to admit that they are entirely responsible for World War I and consequently have to pay for it. So now Germany has to pay for World War I. But, you know, England and France can't pay for this war, and they won. Germany fought and lost this war. There is no conceivable way Germany is able to pay for World War I. So when it comes time for Germany to pay back these bills to England and France, they don't have any money. But in 1919, there is a country that does have money. So Germany is going to ask the United States for loans. And American banks are only going to be too happy to loan the German monies at interest. So the Germans are going to get these loans from American banks, and with that money, they're going to give it to the English and French, and the English and French are going to go ahead and pay back American debt. What you have is basically money just making this really weird, bizarro land circle from America to Germany to England and France, and then back again. Now, this is all perfectly fine so long as Americans continue to give out money. But when the stock market crashes, American banks are no longer in a position to give out loans. In fact, they need all their money back. So when Germany comes and asks for a loan, like, yeah, you know, listen, we're going to need a little bit of money this month, we're going to pay back some bills, the American banks are going to be like, sorry, actually, we need all our money back. And when the American banks recall their loans on Germany, it crashes the German banks. And now what you're going to have is this domino effect that's going to ripple out across Europe, in which the German banks are going to collapse, and when England and France needs their money back, the German banks don't have it, so England and France can't pay back their loans, and their banks also collapse as well. In other words, what the United States is basically going to do is it's going to gift wrap the Great Depression and give it to Europe, especially Germany. This is a horrendous thing, because not only is Europe going to be unable to buy Ford automobiles, but this economic depression is going to be the deciding factor in bringing about World War II. As the Great Depression took hold in the 1930s, especially in 1931, 1932, the collapse just seemed limitless. 25% of the workforce was unemployed. For African Americans, it was probably as high as 50%, to be honest with you. And that's just outright unemployment. Maybe as many as half the people were underemployed, in which, you know, if I'm a business owner and I have 50 employees and I'm not making very much, I'm not selling very much product, and as a result I'm not making very much money, I have to lay off workers. But I know if I lay off a worker, you know, they're gonna starve. So what I do is I call my employees together and I say, listen, you know, you're all working 40 hours at this amount of money, and now you're going to be working 20 hours at half of what you made before. And with half the money that you're making, I'm hoping that you can keep a roof over your head, and I'm hoping you can put at least a little bit of food on your table. Underemployed. And as many as half the country's population fell into that category. It's just tragic scenes. What you're looking at here is an image of children on Christmas Day lined up to get food. And one of the shocking things about this image is how well dressed those kids are. And imagine just the devastation of admitting that you can't feed your kids. You know, it's just a failure. You failed as a parent. The basic thing that you need to do as a parent is to provide food for your children, and you couldn't do it. And you didn't want people to think that you weren't any good and that you didn't love them, so you did your best to dress them up in the best clothes that you had, and you took them downtown so that way they can get food. Take a look at that line. They're just kids. They only have enough food to feed the kids. They do not have enough food to feed those adults. They were on their own. And you get a family evicted a couple weeks before Christmas, and you take a look at that guy and tell me that he don't want to work. That guy's going to work if you give him a job, but there was just none to be had. There was no employment available for anybody. And as a result, he lost his job and he lost his ability to provide for his children and put a roof over their head. And these people without any lodgings had to just find shelter wherever they could, and sometimes they built just shanty towns in the middle of public parks that they called Hoovervilles. Bread lines in America, a bread line in New York in which you see the line stretching out as far as the eye can see. With no money and no food and people have no jobs, they basically just took to the road, and you have millions of Americans that just drifted across this country trying to find some place to work, some place to go, some place to settle down. Economic refugees, essentially. And the Great Depression created millions of them. What's crazy about the Great Depression is that, it's just one of those things where when it rains, it pours. In the middle of the country's greatest economic calamity, we're also going to experience the worst environmental catastrophe in our country's history. And this is entirely related to the Homestead Act that was passed in the 1850s, 1840s. The government trying to settle the Great Plains where the Plains Indians lived and were basically destroyed when the buffalo were hunted to extinction, near extinction anyways. And they're going to give away that land to populations that they saw better fit, right? Social Darwinism, racism for the most part. But it's going to bring millions of people to the plains. But if you look at that landscape, anybody with any sense at all could have looked at that and just seen the warning for what it was. Grassland occupies a very specific environmental niche in which if it rained any less, it would be a desert. And if it rained any more, it would be a forest. It's on that cusp between just enough water for something to live there and not enough for anything else. And what you have is an ecology that developed over millions and millions of years to live in that arid, dry, very infrequent rain. And the plains sod, the plains grass that existed all across the Midwest of this continent was just an incredible thing. The root structure was nearly a foot thick. And it was that thick so that way it could basically extract every bit of water it could find. And what farmers are going to do is they're going to plow up that grassland and plant wheat. Now, wheat can't grow there naturally. And what happens is kind of like a very cruel joke in many ways, because when farmers began to settle in the Great Plains, what happened was this unprecedented period of increased rain, way more than average. And people just kind of thought that that's just the way it was, that the rain followed the plow. In other words, if you plowed, it would rain. That was just how God worked. And these people plowed up that grass and planted wheat, and it rained, and everything was fine, except if things ever got back to the way they normally were, in other words, if that period of extreme rainfall actually dipped, then these people would find just absolute ruin. And that's what happened in the 1930s, in which you have one dry year and another dry year and another dry year. And the dry cycle just kept on going. And the wheat, with its shallow root system, just wasn't able to hold on, and it just disappeared and turned to dust. And now, even worse, this region is just lowlands. There's no hills. There's nothing to block that wind. And with that grass gone and that root system gone, there's nothing now to hold down that dirt. And as the wind began to blow it began to pick up this dirt and fling it into the air and create these incredible dust storms. And the dust would get into the atmosphere like 10,000 feet and have this really weird effect in which it created this static electrical charge that would actually scoop up even more dirt. And then you just have this perpetual cycle of these dust storms that would get so large they would just block out the sun. Livestock that was trapped in the open would suffocate, and they would find dirt in the lungs. People would get lost and be killed in these things. It would just swallow up entire towns. And the farmers in this region, I mean, it was just an ecological bomb that went off. And just this ruination in which millions of people are now going to become economic refugees, environmental refugees, with no way of holding on to that farm, no way of paying that mortgage. They're going to pack up their family and go to anywhere else that they can think of to find a job. California, maybe. You know, this is where the grapes of wrath come in. That story of the Judds leaving Oklahoma and trying to find someplace better. But of course, there's no jobs in California. And what these people experienced was, you know, prejudice, racism. You know, there's not enough for us, there surely ain't enough for you. So they were called Okies, this derogatory term. Get out of here, Okie, you don't belong. This is where that image of the migrant mother comes in, you know, stranded on the side of the road, stuck. Dorothea Lange comes across her and takes this photograph that has come to symbolize the suffering and the desperation of millions of Americans during this time period. It was a traumatic time in American history. The dust would get in people's lungs and they would develop something called dust ammonia, in which the very fine particles of dust would become lodged and people would essentially choke to death on it. Today, the Great Plains is still considered the breadbasket of America. And they've compensated with the infrequent rainfall by being able to drill very deep wells. And what they found is that one of the world's largest aquifers is several hundred feet below the ground. And they were able to tap into that aquifer and use that water to essentially water their crops. The problem, however, is that we've been doing that now for a couple decades, and we have been taking far more water out of that aquifer than has been naturally been able to put back in. It gets to the point where that's not going to be a source that we're going to be able to rely on, and how we're going to water these crops and continue to feed the large population that we have is, you know, remains up in the open. I firmly believe that water is going to be one of the issues that's going to drive humanity for the next 50 to 60 years. How are we going to find fresh water? You know, one of the things about being president is that when you're president, you get all the credit or you get all the blame. And Hoover is the president when the Great Depression really kind of grips the United States, and as a result he is going to by and large get the blame. I'm a little lenient on the guy, but I mean, he's interesting in a way because he seemed to have had the perfect resume to deal with this economic crisis. Before he was president, he was an orphan. He was kind of a rags to riches story, ultimately made a bunch of money in business, and then became a philanthropist for the most part. Just, you know, spent his time trying to do good work. During World War I, actually today after World War I, he is going to organize the relief and feed millions of people who might have otherwise gone without food. So he's a hero in Europe. I mean, there's streets named after this guy. And then he comes back to the United States and the Mississippi River floods and he does the same thing. He organizes relief and feeds a bunch of people, and he is a national hero. He's just a celebrity. And this economic crisis grips the United States, and who better to lead this government than Hoover? But Hoover is a laissez-faire president, and he is expecting really Americans to kind of pull through by and large on their own and organize their own relief. And the economic crisis is just too big for them. Too big for corporations. It requires a much larger presence, a government, full government response. And Hoover's really never willing to put the full might of the government behind this crisis. And as a result, he just became more and more the object of ridicule and outright scorn by the American people. His name itself will actually become symbolic of the hardships. All right, if you have no money in your pockets and you pull your pockets out, all right, and you just see the lining hanging out of your pants, well, then you're flying Hoover flags. If you don't have a lot of food, but you have 2 pieces of bread, well, that's a Hoover sandwich. 2 pieces of bread, nothing in between. If you're out on the streets and, you don't have a blanket, you just have some newspapers, Hoover blanket. Bad times are hoovering over us, right? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So, yeah, they kind of had fun with it, but they were outright angry at him. He's going to run for re-election, and as you can imagine, it's just not going to go well for the guy. There's just too many things. He's overwhelmed for the most part. The Democrats are going to nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt to run against him. He's an interesting choice. Roosevelt, he is the 5th cousin, once removed, Theodore Roosevelt, so distantly related. Marries his cousin, actually, Eleanor. That being said, though, a more remarkable American, Eleanor Roosevelt's just top-notch. She's outstanding. She and another event on Roosevelt is ultimately going to shape him politically. Now, by and large, he's shaped by what she believes in. Roosevelt is, he's kind of from the upper crust. He's rich. And, as a fairly young guy, he's kind of aloof. He doesn't really understand the problems of an average, ordinary, working American. And how would he, right? He's not average. He's not ordinary. He's rich. He went to the best schools. So Eleanor kind of grounds him on the everyday problems of the populace. But, the other factor was that he caught polio fairly late in life. That's unusual. In the 1930s and 40s, polio was a scourge in this country. It was not very well understood, and as a result, it created widespread fear. People would go out into public, and all of a sudden, they'd come back and they'd not feel very well. They'd kind of have a fever. They'd go to sleep. And when they woke up, the polio virus would destroy their muscles. And as a result, they would wake up with varying degrees of paralysis. They wouldn't be able to move their legs again. They wouldn't be able to move their diaphragm again, the thing that allows the lungs to expand and retract. That diaphragm would be destroyed and the person wouldn't be able to breathe. And a lot of times these people had to find themselves in like this medieval contraction, this iron lung, which would, with negative pressure, force air in and out of their body. And they would have to be confined there permanently for the rest of their life. It's just a terrible thing. It caused widespread fear and panic. And as a result, kind of like what we see with the coronavirus, the American streets were empty, except that polio seemed to target children way more than adults. And it was a childhood plague, and scared parents out of their mind. It was kind of unusual that Franklin Delano Roosevelt caught it when he was a young man. Same thing. He went swimming in the lake and with his family and felt fine. And when he got back to the house, he kind of felt a little off, and he decided, I'll just take a break, go upstairs, rest. And when he woke up the next morning, just things were definitely not right. He couldn't move his legs. He couldn't move his lower body. Polio. And he was a beginning politician, kind of making a name for himself, and it just derailed all of that. He had to spend the next couple of years trying to regain what strength he could and find a way to combat this disease, and to kind of come to grips with the new person he's going to be, which is handicapped. Roosevelt is not going to be able to walk again. That virus ruined his ability to move his legs. And the image you see here is one that is just very, very rare. There's not a lot of images of Roosevelt in a wheelchair. He didn't like that image. So by and large, it's just family photographs meant for family that saw that. He kept the fact that he could not walk from the public a secret. And just to show you how different it is today than it was back then, when he was running for president, he kind of gathered the reporters around and said, hey, listen, can you not take a picture of me in the wheelchair? I'd appreciate that. And the reporters went, yeah, fine, that's fine. No problem, we can do that. And sure enough, they did. And the fact that he couldn't walk very well was a very well-kept secret. That just could not have happened today. He was able to fake it a bit and create essentially a scaffolding for his legs. This is essentially a metal contraction that was worn under his pants and then locked in place, and then with straps that went up to his shoulders here. He could use his shoulder to lift his legs, and with the support of two canes and somebody kind of stabilizing him, he could give the appearance of being able to walk, I wouldn't say normally, but being able to walk. It took a lot of practice and it was quite painful, but on rare occasions in which Roosevelt needed to give the appearance of strength, his inauguration, for example, he saved it for those occasions. But by and large, he's going to devise various ways to conceal the fact that he wasn't able to walk. He will give a lot of speeches from his car, which he had custom made, in which you could operate the brake and the accelerator with controls on the steering wheel, and then they would build a ramp, and he would just wheel onto the ramp and then have a podium that was basically yay high, and then from the car, just kind of leaning out the car, giving a little speech, and then he was done. He would just, crank that thing into gear and ride off, and people, didn't really think twice about it. Just kind of thought the president liked cars. What a guy. So he's going to run against Hoover with an entirely different message. Hoover's message by and large was, it's going to end soon. Don't worry. Just keep on course. You're fine. And we're going to pull out of this, and you're all going to do it, essentially. And Roosevelt ran with basically a message of, I am going to treat this depression as if it was a foreign enemy invading our shores. I am going to utilize the full power of the federal government to combat this economic collapse. And, people really responded to that. They wanted a government that would get off the sidelines and get into the ring and fight with them. They're fighting, and they wanted the government to fight with them, and that's what Roosevelt was promising. He basically said, I'm going to try everything, and if we try and it fails, then we'll get rid of it and we'll try something new. But the government's going to be in the ring with you now fighting, and that's what I'm going to bring to the presidency. And as you can see from the Electoral College, it's a landslide. It's a landslide. Basically, with 472 electoral votes to 59, note Delaware voted for Hoover. Delaware. Come on, Delaware.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Roosevelt's platform, by and large, is called the New Deal, right? It harkens back to TR's platform, which was the Square Deal, right? TR had the Square Deal. FDR now has the New Deal. The core of the New Deal is the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief. The government is not going to allow its population to starve. They are going to provide what food is necessary to keep the people from starving. Right? So outright relief for the people. Recovery. The government is going to provide jobs. And this is really, it's weird. It's the only way we have right now to deal with economic crisis. It's essentially the government taking a giant shovel and throwing it at the problem. That's the only tool we have, it seems like. In order to get the country out of a bust cycle, you have to inject money into the system. So the government is going to throw money at this Great Depression in an effort to get people spending again. The other part of the New Deal is reform. they're going to pass laws to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. An example of reform is that Roosevelt is going to pass new laws, the Glass-Steagall Act, which is going to basically ensure that banks cannot gamble with other people's money. And, it served the country well until the 1990s, when the government, in its infinite wisdom, saw fit to get rid of that law and allow banks to gamble on the stock market, which they immediately did, which led to a huge increase in stocks, because all this money began to flow into the stock market, and led to the 2007 economic collapse, the home market collapse. That we've learned nothing, essentially. So, and by the way, banks can still gamble on the stock market with other people's money. So, it's good. It's a good thing. It's not. The recovery part is the most interesting, in my opinion, of the New Deal, in which you have all these new government agencies that are going to take shape with the whole purpose of putting people to work. Historians call this alphabet soup, actually, because there's a lot of acronyms. The TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, you have the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the NRA, the National Relief Association. Now, you don't need to remember all those unless you're getting a, PhD in history. If you are getting a PhD in history, then by all means, make flashcards. But, basically they're all going to do the same thing. The TVA is going to build all these dams and generate cheap electricity to electrify a section of this country that had not had electricity. There's people, basically laboring the way it was done 100 years ago. And in the process of providing cheap electricity, they're also going to put people to work building these dams. So injecting money into the economy, giving these people a job and allowing them to work. The WPA is my favorite, the Work Project Administration. And, again, another government program. But this is the government basically thinking, what are we going to do with these artists? All right? What do you do with an artist? I guess you put them to work. So the government is going to basically pay artists to do art. And, the art has its own look. Once you see one Work Project Administration artwork, you can kind of recognize all of them. It's going to basically glorify work and glorify the worker. And, they put it on post offices. They put it on school cafeteria walls. We got a large number of them in the Tampa airport. So if you're about ready to check in or go to security, or you're in the terminal and you look up and you see those large artworks, that's all WPA art. Just trying to give these artists something to do during the Great Depression, try to get a little bit of money in their pocket and, have them do something useful. So the government putting people to work. In 5 years, the New Deal will remake America and bring about more social change than at any point in the country's history. The New Deal will erect institutional scaffolding designed to provide stability and predictability. Security for vulnerable individuals, security for capitalists and consumers, for workers and employees, corporations, farms, homeowners, bank owners, and builders. Job security, life cycle security, financial security, and market security. This security may not outright lift the country out of the Great Depression, but it will help lay the groundwork for the 1950s prosperity. As Roosevelt stated, we are going to make a country where nobody is left out. The New Deal will also change the social fabric of America. It will bring new immigrant communities into the American system. Tens of millions of American workers will enjoy the benefits of a good union job. Roads, schools, bridges, and hospitals will be built, along with 12 million new acres of land will be put under protection. As David M. Kennedy explained, above all, the New Deal gave to countless Americans who never had much of it a sense of security, and with it, a sense of having a stake in their country. And it did it all without shredding the American Constitution or sundering the American people. At a time when despair and alienation were prostrating other peoples under the heel of dictatorship, that was no small accomplishment. Roosevelt and the New Deal modified and strengthened the American system, and in turn, prevented ideological radicalism that consumed other countries. All in all, Roosevelt gives people hope and gives them a purpose. But it does not end the Great Depression. The country is going to languish through the Great Depression all during the 1930s and into the first part of the 1940s. The only thing that's going to get this country out of the Great Depression is war. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, this country is going to put really the full might of its government resources into fighting this war. And all of a sudden, people who couldn't find a job are now going to have all the work they could possibly ask for. People are going to be working 2 jobs. In fact, there's going to be so many jobs open that women now are going to be able to work, and African Americans in the South are going to be able to work. That's really what lifts this country out of the Great Depression. That being said, that's our next topic. Thank you all for watching. This is the History Class. I'm Mr. Wannen. Next topic is World War II. Take care.